Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. Okay, I'll admit it. Up until the mid-2010s, I freaking hated Kiss. I thought they sucked. I thought they were stupid cock rock for dumbed-down simpletons. I thought their act was cartoonish and cheesy. And I thought they were obnoxiously sexist and maybe even a bit misogynist. It turns out I was only wrong about the first one. That's right. It took me to sit down and actually give their 1975 live album, obviously named Alive, an honest chance to finally, really, get it. And I did. I finally got it with Kiss. Yes, they were dumb cock rock. Yes, they were cartoonish and cheesy. Yes, their lyrics after a while did get obnoxious and grating with their incessant macho posturing and blatant casual sexism. But what I also got was how powerful and even moving a brand of cock rock they were, especially as their live album made abundantly clear. It made me want to go back and reevaluate their early studio albums. And what I found was a band that pioneered a brand of tawdry, sleazy hard rock and heavy metal that basically invented glam metal for the following decade. Thick, heavy guitar riffs, a pummeling but surprisingly swinging rhythm section, and raunchy lyrics that touched on every base regarding having sex with women. While I have a deep dislike for anything related to glam or hair metal or any of that ilk from the 1980s, like with any case between innovators and imitators, Kiss's original brand of glam metal or flashy hard rock, while dumb, had an oddly charming innocence and an endearing audaciousness, probably because they were the first ones to do this kind of thing. Perhaps even more important to their influence and legacy is their stage show. It was a bombastic live show that included colored lights, lasers, pyrotechnics, flame-throwing, coughing up blood, and, of course, those costumes. Black leather outfits with chains and diamond studs, combined with Japanese-style kabuki makeup to make these guys look like a gang of S&M bondage-loving aliens from outer space. On a more controversial note, if you're a rock and roll purist, you also had the unabashed, unashamed self-marketing, self-promotion, and licensing of all things under the sun. Kiss action figures, Kiss lunchboxes, Kiss comic books, Kiss clothing apparel of all kinds for both men, women, and children. Of course, Elvis Presley and the Beatles had done extensive promotion and marketing via merchandising, but never on the scale that Kiss did. It made you wonder if George Lucas was watching and keeping notes while formulating his Star Wars empire. And you know what? You can dislike their music all you like. Even then, on an objective level, no one can deny or refute the immense influence and impact that Kiss had not only on the historical trajectory of rock music, but on pop culture in general. On this podcast, we have a parallel universe segment where we yearn for a time when rock music was still a mainstream genre and a major part of the pop cultural zeitgeist. Well, Kiss were a pop cultural zeitgeist all to themselves, and they were never more of an it band than in the mid to late 1970s. So let's take a step back to the 1970s once more for some hard rock crunchiness, but this time we're going from the previous episode's funky south of Lynyrd Skynyrd to the gritty urban decadence of Kiss as we analyze the decade they helped dominate. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and we bring you Kiss in the 1970s.
So Arturo, did you know that this is officially our 90th episode of the Curmudgeon Rock Report?
Well, I do know now because I'm looking at our outline for this episode right now in front of me on the computer screen. Yeah, we've been doing this for 3 years now, huh?
No, almost 4 years. We've been doing this. Our first episode goes back to January of 2021. And wow. It's on my mind, and I have to brag on us for our longevity. You know, we've obviously gotten better. We didn't know what the hell we were doing when we first started. Right. We barely know what we're doing now, but we really didn't know what we were doing back then. But as part of this episode, it took me back to episode 5, where we talked a little bit about one of the records that we're going to talk about in the main core of this episode when we talk about Kiss.
Yes.
And so we published that on March 9th, 2021. That may not seem like a long time ago, but realize, folks, that was 2 weeks before I got vaccinated for COVID for the first time. We're talking pre-vaccination period of COVID. I also was 7 weeks away from getting married. Let's see, Biden had just become president. January 6th had just happened. And there was no Ukraine war. There was no Israel war. There was probably there was no real ridiculous inflation in the U.S. At that point. It actually, coming off of COVID, it actually was an easier time than it is now, which is kind of funny. But I have to brag on us because most podcasts, they don't get past episode 10. But we've stuck with it because, you know, we're on a mission. You know, like I said, we're not in this for the money.
Yeah, we thoroughly enjoy it.
Yeah, we thoroughly enjoy it. But also, it's as we say at the top of the show, this is your podcast, everybody, and we are dedicated to bringing you your podcast full of actual rock and roll talk about actual rock and roll. That, you know, we're treating 1974 like it's an event still here in 2024, 50 years later. Rock and roll shall and will truly never die. And it's because of podcasts.
And what better band to talk about who actually celebrates that than Kiss?
Yeah, absolutely. Kiss is the embodiment of the Curmudgeon Rock Report in a lot of ways. Dumb, fun, big, bombastic, kick-ass rock band. And this is the kind of stuff that gives us fuel for our fire and keeps us going here on the Curmudgeon Rock Report. And I guess with that said, let us now segue and cross over into the other side of the space-time continuum. Arturo, are you ready to visit the parallel universe?
Yes, in a parallel universe where rock music is still a popular genre and still part of the cultural zeitgeist. We have 2 albums that I like the one I have and you like the one you have. So,
well, hey, at least there's that. Yeah, folks. So the parallel universe, as the name suggests, this is where we ponder if rock and roll still truly mattered as in them being the zeitgeist, if they were still selling the Rolling Stones, and if they were still on the billboards, and if they were still selling out the stadiums and the arenas and not having to cancel their tours because of $100 ticket prices, what would that world look like and who would be the stars? And so that's what we cover. We cover new and newish records by artists we think that you ought to check out and that you ought to dig. And so, Arturo, for this episode, who in the parallel universe are you covering?
Yes, hailing from Congo, the collective known as Kokoko, with an exclamation point at the end, merged the traditional indigenous music of their country, lots of chanting and call and response vocals, with some cutting edge and downright funky electronic dance music. The strands of EDM that Kokoko draw from tend to be the hard-hitting, dance floor-friendly vibes of techno, so you can safely call them African techno. The results on their new album, Butu, are often thrilling and appropriately butt-shaking. The singles Bazo Banga and Mokili are absolute bangers, while other tracks like Kidoka put the percussiveness of traditional Congolese music into electronic overdrive, and Nasili Nini just draws you in with its hypnotic synth hooks. It's a solid 3.5 out of 5-star album, and definitely recommended if you're looking for something unlike anything else out there. Chris?
Yeah, it truly is unlike anything else I've heard in a long time. It is African EDM, and it is definitely butt shaking. That is an epic or as an apt description of this record. I think one of the interesting things about it is that it's kind of it's got an irony in the sense that it evokes the albums by the Talking Heads from the early '80s, namely Remain in Light and Speaking in Tongues.
Right.
It kind of goes over the same rhythmic and instrumental vibes, and feel like kind of clip chanting that Byrne kind of adopted some of the African chanting for some of the stuff he was doing on those records. And so he appropriates it from Afrobeat and from traditional African rhythms to do his stuff, sort of white boy, new wave here in America in the early 1980s. And now these guys are taking African rhythms and taking their traditional stuff and ramping up an EDM and in some ways sounding like the Talking Heads. So it's kind of neat. And I'll definitely have to check them out. Apparently, this is their second studio album.
Yeah.
They had one about 5 years ago, pre-COVID.
Right.
They came out with one, and so I'll definitely be spending a little bit more time with Coco.
Mhm.
And I will definitely also be spending lots of extra time with the album that I'm covering on this episode of the Curmudgeon Rock Report. Now, I have heard 3 great American rock records that were released within the past 2 months. We covered 2 of those, OC's Sork's 80 and Jack White's No Name, on our last episode. And I'm covering the 3rd album, MJ Lenderman's Manning Fireworks, on this episode. So let's talk about MJ Lenderman and about this album. Lenderman is a gifted singer, songwriter, and guitarist from Asheville, North Carolina, who first got widespread attention, and deservedly so, with the release of 2022's terrific Boat Songs. That album was a really quirky affair, combining alt country and grunge influences into a hard-driving yet melodic brew that paid homage to Michael Jordan's famous hangover game in the 1997 NBA Finals, his father's adoration for Dan Marino, the Dolphins quarterback, and the emotional connection created by violent pro wrestling matches, among other off-kilter topics. I put the album at number 20 on my top 20 albums of 22 list for this podcast when we recorded an episode dedicated to those albums in December of 22. Well, after almost 2 years of repeated listening, I now would put that album in my top 5 from 2022. Boat Songs was and still is a serious grower. It was a man-child album of the highest order. Now, that man-child has matured, and stunningly so. His new album, which is called Manning Fireworks, still evokes Uncle Tupelo and No Depression alt country in spots, and it still crunches at times like early 90s alt rock. But Lenderman's clear North Star this time out is Neil Young. It's really uncanny how Lenderman approximates his obvious influences penchant for meaty guitar hooks on the one end and acoustic beauty on the other. Check out both the bashing, crashing licks of the moving wristwatch and the even more moving, softly caressing lilt of the album's best song, Rip Torn, and you'll hear what I'm talking about. The big giveaway, though, is the striking 6.5-minute guitar feedback coda of Bark at the Moon, which ends the album. It's more absorbing and way, way less annoying than it logically should be, precisely because Lenderman's heart is very, very, very embedded into the proceedings, much like Neil's would in delivering similar feedback art. The most surprising thing about Manning Fireworks, though, is how it finds Lenderman eschewing the absurdism that marked Boat Songs for a more straightforward poignancy. Noticeably gone are the goofy lyrics, and in their place are the sentiments of a young guy gaining wisdom about the people in and out of his life. The growth is perhaps most evident on another album highlight for me, the driving She's Leaving You, during which Lenderman delivers tough love to a friend in the midst of a breakup. Quote, "It gets dark. We all have work to do," end quote. He sings on the chorus. Yes, yes, we do. And he knows it now, too. Manning Fireworks is 38 minutes long and 9 songs long, and it grows progressively stronger, placing the waltzy title song, which is probably the album's worst, right up front. And it just from there, the joys and peaks keep rolling and they keep coming, and the album just keeps building. And it really is an enjoyable record and one that I think I'll be playing on repeat for years to come. Right now, it's between Manning Fireworks and Beyonce's Cowboy Carter for the year's top album for me at the moment. I think it's that good. Arturo, I'm assuming you probably disagree. I know that you've shrugged your shoulders about Lenderman in the past.
Yeah, I'm not as high on this guy as you are. This does not mean that I think he sucks. He doesn't suck at all. In fact, I much prefer his solo stuff over that really shitty band that he's in,
What,
Wednesday.
Wednesday?
Yeah, his solo stuff is better than that. But my thing on Lenderman is that, like I said, he doesn't suck. He's not bad. It's just, to me, it's just conservative, bland, safe, middle of the road country rock. Nothing bad, nothing great. It's just, it's just there. And very few of his songs really hang in there with me as far as, like, arresting melodies or catchy hooks. I do like the song Rudolph. That song rocks.
Yeah, that is a good song.
And the very last track, like you said, "Bark at the Moon," which is actually, like I said, that long instrumental feedback coda at the end, but it's actually a pretty good song in its own right. I mean, Lenderman's lyrics are witty and occasionally funny, but they kind of leave me empty at the end. It's just, okay, yeah, it's funny, yeah, okay. He's getting over the breakup of his relationship by playing Guitar Hero and doing Ozzy Osbourne songs, hence the title "Bark at the Moon," which is what the last song is about.
Yep.
But it just leaves me empty a little bit. I mean, it's inoffensive country rock. That's how
Yeah, I don't think he plays it safe at all, actually. I think that because of the wit, because of some of the off-kilter stuff that he does, and some of that sort of hippie, he's like hippy dippy Western North Carolina mountain music. But
The only
cranked
song
up.
that's adventurous musically is that last track, "Bark at the Moon." Really.
Yeah, I mean, but he's also just a very good guitar player. And so I just think that there's just really strong guitar playing. I think that the other song from this album that I really like is Joker Lips. There's Joker Lips, there's Rudolph, there's Wristwatch all in a row. But Joker Lips has a really great little riff or little motif that just makes it just really just jump out of the speakers. And he's got a real gift for that sort of that alternating poignancy and crunchiness. And it just shows up over and over and over again on this record. And although, like I said, Rip Torn, which is probably the gentlest thing on it, is probably the best song. And again, I don't see that as being safe at all. I think he's very vulnerable. He's not as goofy anymore. He's not as purely goofy. I mean, Both Songs is a great album and it's really enjoyable, but it's gimmicky in a lot of ways. And I don't see this album as being as gimmicky. And I think he's playing it straighter, which is more
No,
risky.
right, yeah. No, I don't think it's gimmicky either. But when I'm calling it conservative and safe, I'm saying, and just musically, it's just nothing that I haven't heard before done better by, our hero Neil Young, for example.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's okay. It's just good background country rock. It's how I describe it.
Yeah, but it's the best background country rock in a long time. Yeah, I mean, you have to go back. I mean, I can't even think of somebody that. I mean, yeah. Honestly, I think this album is. Yeah, I mean, you can hit me back with 2 words, "Big Thief," but
Yeah.
I think that this holds up. I think that this is really, really strong. It's one of the strongest records of the last couple of years. And again, one that I'll be returning to. I'm a big Lenderman fan. I think that the guy's got the chops, and I look forward to. He's only 25 years old. I really look forward to see what he's got in his quiver uh, in the future. I'm really excited about that. Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming. Nearly 50 years ago, Kiss was the greatest show on earth. They really were. They were the epitome of the rock and roll spirit, with all the face paint and all the fake blood and all the fire and the leather and just the gnarliness. They were where definitely where it was at. So much so that they scared the shit out of all the bands of the early 70s who were still playing it, who were still, getting by on musical chops.
Yeah.
And a story I love to tell, about 20 years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing a true guitar hero in the development of British rock and roll, a guy named Kim Simmons. Kim Simmons was the lead guitarist and band leader for a band named Savoy Brown. And they were contemporaries of Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, of Ian Anderson, and Tony Iommi's Jethro Tull, and Eric Clapton and Cream, and several other, Jimmy Page and the Yardbirds, and Led Zeppelin and Jeff Beck. They came out of that same scene, and they were a really great band. They had a high point in 1971 with the song "Tell Mama." And they were a legit arena touring band. They were very popular in the very early 70s. Well, in late 73, early 74, Simmons told me when I interviewed him in Oswego, New York, 20 years ago, that they had the distinction of being the first tour that Kiss ever had an opening slot for nationally. So the first national tour that they got on was a Savoy Brown tour. And Simmons told me it was the first time that they saw Kiss perform before one of their shows that they knew they were done. that basically Kiss just blew them off the stage and just blew everybody's minds. And it's like, oh, now, us as boring musos that just kind of look at our feet while we're wanking on guitars, we have to follow that shit. And so they realized that the clock was ticking. And of course, as it turns out, Simmons didn't tell me this, but in subsequent research, Kiss was actually fired from that tour because they were upstaging Savoy Brown. And it turns out they actually got fired from opening for Black Sabbath, too, for the same reason. Sabbath was awesome musically, but they didn't put on nearly as good of a show.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, it was the show that mattered. And that really probably truly is the legacy of Kiss. Although when we're talking about the music, they also had in a very basic sense for glam metal, they had some chops, didn't they?
Especially the early records. That's some great songs all throughout.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So Arturo, tell us a little bit more about Kiss. Let's start talking about them, and talk to us about their beginnings and why we care and how they became the Kiss that we all know and love.
Yeah, believe it or not, Kiss really are the quintessential New York City band. And their roots lie in the pretty drab bluesy folk rock sounds of a band called Rainbow. With an Israeli immigrant bassist and singer named Chaim Witz, who changed his name to Gene Klein, and another Jewish musician, rhythm guitarist and vocalist Stanley Eisen, Rainbow formed in 1970 and changed their name to Wicked Lester in 1971. They slogged around the New York music scene for about a year, earning a major label deal with Epic Records. They completed recording sessions for a prospective album, but the band fell apart and disbanded in 1972, leaving the album to be officially unreleased to this day, although you can find bootleg versions of that. Klein and Eisen felt Wicked Lester fell apart due to a lack of solid leadership and clear direction, and vowed not to make that mistake with the next band they would form together. In the fall of 1972, they answered an ad in Rolling Stone magazine placed by a drummer named Peter Criss. Upon meeting him in a nightclub and hearing him play, Klein and Eisen immediately offered Criss the job in their new band as the drummer. They spent the rest of their year, 1972, honing their new, heavier, harder rocking sound. In January 1973, they auditioned and added a new member, lead guitarist Ace Frehley, solidifying the original and classic lineup of the band, soon to be named Kiss. Now, how did they come up with that name? Well, like with most cases in rock history, it's a combination of simplicity and serendipity. One night, while the group was driving around the city and discussing potential band names, Peter Criss mentioned he was once in a band called Lips. Stanley Eisen then made a mental connection and said, "Hey, what about Kiss?" And Kiss it was. This wasn't the only change the band would undertake. Gene Klein decided to further streamline his name by calling himself Gene Simmons, and Stanley Eisen did the same by renaming himself Paul Stanley. From the very beginning, Kiss were all about standing out in a very competitive rock scene. It wasn't enough to have flashy, bombastic rock and roll with catchy melodies, hooks, and tight songwriting. There had to be a look, and a look is where the band excelled. On came the Japanese kabuki-influenced makeup personalized for each member of the group. Simmons was the demon, Stanley was the star child, Criss was the cat, and Frehley was the spaceman. Black leather outfits with chains, spikes, and diamond studs completed the ensemble to give the band the look of a gang of evil sex creatures from outer space.
Yeah,
but guess what? It wasn't enough to have just the look. A stage presence and a total show was in order. And that's what Kiss also excelled at. Simmons would make a concoction out of eggs, yogurt, maple syrup, and red food coloring that would come out of his mouth to make it look like he was spitting blood. He also started to spit flammable liquid onto a torch to give a fire-breathing illusion. Frehley placed light and smoke bombs inside his guitar to make it look like it was bursting into flames whenever he played a tight solo. Criss's drum riser would elevate and emit sparks. And Stanley, the sexy, swaggering frontman, would do his best Pete Townsend imitation by doing the whole whirlwind arm routine and smashing his guitar. Now, you can imagine the band spent a lot of money on their act. So the need to get a record deal sooner than later became imperative. Kiss spent most of 1973 touring around the Northeast, establishing a reputation as an exciting and powerful live band. And they got the attention of former television director Bill Aucoin, who offered to be their manager in October of that year. 1 month later, Aucoin got the band a record deal with Casablanca Records, an independent label that specialized in R&B, funk, and eventually disco music that had distribution with Warner Brothers. When they entered the studio in late 73 to record their debut album, Kiss had a finely honed act, an outrageous reputation to live up to, and a whole backlog of heavy, catchy as hell party rock anthems that would define an era and provide inspiration for a future era in the next decade. So, Chris, what say you about Kiss's beginnings that you haven't said already?
Yeah, they are smarter than they get credit for. That it wasn't just the music that would define them as a rock and roll band. They needed a shtick.
Yeah.
And it was just supremely well thought out. The idea is if they were the band
arguably the greatest shtick in rock and roll history, man.
Oh, well, certainly the most marketable and certainly the most lucrative shtick. in
Yeah.
history. Clearly, without Alice Cooper, there would be no Kiss. So there
Right.
obviously is some influence there as far as the stage show. And it's like, well, how can we outdo Alice, and how can we outdo some of these other bands that are out there? Basically, we'll be the demonic, like you said, the demonic sex creatures from outer space.
Basically, a
And
live action comic book. Basically, is
yeah,
what they became.
they're a live action. They're like a Magna comic book, come to life, and to the point where, and it's so well thought out that they each four of them had a character. The Star Child, the Demon, the Cat, and the Spaceman. Those looks, coincidentally, are all officially trademarked with the
Yeah.
USPTO. They hold
Yep.
trademarks on those makeup
Yeah.
on those makeup styles or those
Yeah.
templates. And
Right.
so, which explains why the guys who replaced Ace Frehley and Peter Criss
Yeah.
after the reunion get to wear the Catman and Spaceman
Right.
outfits.
Yeah.
So, and so they understood that you had to have a product, and you had to have, that it was the show, that it wasn't just the music. And but to be fair, they had the music too. Like they understood, they started off as a folk rock group, but they were hugely influenced by the glam rock of Slade. They've mentioned Slade as a huge influence on them. T-Rex,
Yeah.
Bowie, like Aladdin Sane Bowie,
Yeah.
I think had some influence on them. Clearly Led Zeppelin, clearly Black Sabbath.
Right.
Clearly the Rolling Stones. Obviously, the riff rock coming out of Britain was hugely
Mm.
influential.
Mm.
And, they just knew they knew hooks. They knew how to make big, dopey, fun rock songs about getting laid, and fucking young girls. Uh,
Yeah.
they made it clear that they were young girls, as we'll discuss
Yeah.
as we get into this. But again, just so well thought out and so well done, and the template was there for them to eventually succeed. And I think that it was all about the live show, which is what ended up breaking them big. And
Yeah.
so, but first they had some studio records as the first
Oh
signing
yeah.
of Casablanca Records.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about their humble beginnings as a studio band.
Yeah, their first album, self-titled Kiss from 1974. Right off the bat, Kiss came out with a debut album chock full of some of their most iconic, canonical, well-known songs. Strutter, Deuce, Firehouse, Cold Gin, 100,000 Years, and of course, the surprisingly sympathetic and tender in their own twisted way, Black Diamond, about a prostitute trying to get by in life.
Yep.
All of these tracks are full of swaggering, strutting, badass rock and roll menace. Here is a band that took the heavy metal of Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and injected it with heavy doses of sex and crotch swinging fun. One of rock's all time great debut albums. Chris?
Yeah, it really is. That the riffs are just consistently strong on this record. Ace
Yeah.
Frehley was a hell of a player.
Yeah.
Paul Stanley was a really great singer. Just right out of the gate. I've always loved 100,000 Years. I mean, that's just because it's so proggy. It's in the middle of
Yeah.
this record. Otherwise, they're playing it straight as just like glam metal pop, and then
Yeah.
out of nowhere comes 100,000 Years, which is extremely proggy.
Yeah.
And it should be known that the cover of Bobby Rydell's "Kissin' Time"
Mm.
was not part of the original record. It was one of these things where it wasn't selling to Casablanca Records honchos Neil Bogart's satisfaction. So a couple months later, they went in and they did this cover of Bobby Rydell's "Kissin' Time USA,"
Mm.
and
Mm.
they added it to the record. So that kind of explains that odd inclusion. But it said just one great riff after another. Like you said, Deuce and Strutter. Firehouse is another kick-ass riff. Obviously much better and much more powerful on the live record, but it's a kick-ass riff that deserves its own monument as well. So yeah, just really, really great stuff. And clearly, like I said, the Slade influence is big time.
Yeah. Really is.
Like Deuce.
Yeah.
That's just pure Slade
Mm.
right there. I
Right.
mean, it's kind of like "Come On, Feel the Noise" Part Two. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
for real.
Totally. All right, the next album by Kiss, Hotter Than Hell from 1974 as well. The production team of Kenny Kerner and Richie Wise were behind the mixing board for the making of Kiss's classic debut album. For their follow-up, they and the band wanted to produce a record that reflected the ferocious live sound Kiss were already gaining a growing reputation for. Unfortunately, that didn't happen.
Nope.
Instead, what resulted was an album with an overall murky, muddy sound and drums that sounded oddly thin and compressed. For these Gen X ears, it sounds like Kiss went into the studio with Husker Du's producer. In a 2013 interview with Greg Prato, Wise admitted he was going through some deep personal issues during the time of recording, and those troubles seeped into the energy effort put into producing the band. But it's a credit to the band that they were still on fire as songwriters, and that the songs managed to transcend the poor production job and still come off like a great album. Parasite is one of the greatest riffs Ace Frehley ever came up with.
Oh, yeah.
The title track, Hotter Than Hell, and Let Me Go, Rock and Roll are gritty, heavy, arena-ready rock anthems that came alive in a live setting. And of course, there's always Gene Simmons being the classy guy in the band with a song like Goin' Blind about a 93-year-old man who has an affair with a 16-year-old girl. Oh, well, it still rocks like hell and would go on to be covered and done better, in my opinion, 20 years later by Seattle sludge metal titans, the Melvins. Chris?
Hey, go figure. Yeah, this album's not quite, it's not as strong song-wise, or it's not as consistently strong as the debut record, but it's got its moments. Like I said, Parasite is just kick-ass. I'm a big fan of Watching You. There's a reason why Watching You made the cut for the live record. Right. And then, Let Me Go, Rock and Roll is fun. It may be the cheesiest song, one of the cheesiest songs they ever did during this period. It's not as, during this period, it's not nearly as cheesy as Crazy, Crazy Nights. 1987's finest. But like I said, there's lots of, there's lots to like about this record. Like you said, Going Blind, it's dirty as hell, but it's fun. That's Gene Simmons. If you had to describe Gene Simmons as a songwriter, dirty as hell but fun. I think it's how you go. And again, didn't capture the live sound, didn't capture quite the power, and it does sound like it's kind of made underwater. But again, its finest moments rock as hard as anything as they did on the first record. And like you said, Parasite might actually be my favorite Ace Frehley riff. That he wrote. Remember, of all the songs he wrote, that might be his strongest effort. Yeah, for sure.
Next, Dressed to Kill from 1975. Hotter Than Hell didn't sell as well as its predecessor, and since Casablanca Records' financial situation wasn't too good at the time, remember, the label's disco catalog hadn't quite taken off yet. Label boss Neil Bogart took Kiss off the road and put them back in the studio to record a new album, with Bogart himself producing the record because they couldn't afford to hire a professional producer. Recorded and mixed within 1 month in February 1975 and released 1 month later, the result was Dressed to Kill, an album that proved to be a bit of a commercial breakthrough, hitting number 32 on the Billboard album chart due to the soon-to-be classic single Rock and Roll All Night, getting constant airplay on FM and album-oriented rock radio. The production and sound quality are much better this time around, as are the songs. Aside from Rock and Roll All Night, yes, you all know it. I wanna rock and roll all night. Yeah, you know that song. Yeah. You have the MC5 on speed rocker Room Service, which, knowing how much singer Paul Stanley loved to convey his salacious appetites on record, you can guess what it's about. Yep. Stanley also provides Rock Bottom, one of the album's standout tracks that starts out with an uncharacteristically gorgeous Ace Frehley acoustic guitar passage before blasting into infectious cock rock. In a good way, of course. Gene Simmons gives us the swaggering, swinging glam rock of Two-Timer and the raunchy stomp of She, and Stanley's penchant for pop hooks and irresistible pop rock Andy, no matter how dumb the lyrics are never more prominent than on Come On and Love Me and Anything for My Baby. It's this Curmudgeon's choice for Kiss's best studio album. Chris?
Yeah, I would not go as far as to call it their best studio record. I think there's some strong stuff on there. It obviously sounds better than the two before it. They obviously were self-consciously trying to write pop hits, hence why they came up with Rock and Roll All Night and
Right.
Come On and Love Me. I mean, both of those are clearly written with the radio in mind. For me, it's an interesting record to hear because Come On and Love Me, She, and Rock and Roll All Night made the cut for the live record, which we'll talk about next. And the versions of the live album are much more famous than because of all the piped in crowd noise, all the overdub crowd noise, which kind of, really sells those things and makes them that much more exciting. But it's interesting to hear the original studio concoctions without all that, with all the fanfare. So Rock and Roll All Night is a truly that's a great rock and roll song. That's a great rock and roll anthem, and it's one of their best songs. And it's just, I mean, there's a reason why your grandmother knows it, and your grandmother's grandmother probably knew it too
Yeah.
when she was still alive.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a classic song.
Yeah.
And
You know who else? You know who else likes this album, Chris?
who's that? Who's that? Who's that?
Our favorite all-time great music critic, Robert Christgau. In a review he wrote in 1975 for the Village Voice, this is what he has to say about Dressed to Kill. Quote, I feel skitsy about this record. It rocks with a brutal, uncompromising force that's very impressive, sort of a slicked down, tightened up, heavied out MC5, and the songwriting is much improved from albums 1 and 2. But the lyrics recall the liberal fantasy of rock concert as Nuremberg rally, equating sex with victimization in a display of male supremacism that glints with humor only at its cruelest. Song titles like Room Service and Ladies in Waiting. In this context, the band's refusal to bear the faces that lie beneath the clown makeup becomes ominous, which may be just what they intend, though for the worst of reasons. You know damn well that if they didn't have both eyes on maximum commerciality, they would have called themselves Blowjob. B.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's exactly. The ugly Jewish guys underneath the makeup are nowhere in sight. Truly nowhere in sight. So, good take, Bob. Maybe they should have been called Blowjob.
Well, we're going to hear from Christgau again later. But
I'm
next,
sure we will.
Big breakthrough.
Yep.
Alive, the live album from 1975 as well. While Kiss's profile had started to rise with Dressed to Kill and the Rock and Roll All Night single, their record sales had not quite matched the enthusiastic response to their blazing live shows, which were selling out all over the country and whose fierce word-of-mouth reputation were elevating the band to larger and larger concert venues. Since the studio albums had yet to capture the live energy and to help prop up Casablanca's records' sagging fortunes, the band thought of a simple yet ingenious idea. Why not release a live album that reflected what Kiss were all about, and a double live album at that? Listening to it now, it's hard not to see this as a de facto greatest hits compilation, since it captures the very best of their first 3 studio albums in maximum hard-hitting, live-in-concert sound quality. It was a massive commercial success, one much needed by both Kiss and their record label, and it landed in number 9 on the Billboard album chart, while the live version of Rock and Roll All Night was their breakthrough hit single, going to number 12 on the Billboard Pop Singles chart. From here on out, Kiss were a permanent fixture as an arena rock band. If you really need just one Kiss album in your collection or one to just stream constantly, this is pretty much all you need. Chris?
Yeah. Alive is the best record they ever did, and it is so revered that it actually placed at number 305 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums ever made in 2020. And it's been on all 3 iterations of that list, coincidentally. and I think that's its highest placement. So its status is growing. So 305. It's a special record for a couple of reasons. One, in terms of capturing the experience of the Kiss show and the experience of a live show, it's one of the greatest documents in rock and roll history. The only thing that I can compare to it as far as capturing the experience of what it may have been like is Live at Leeds by The Who.
Yeah.
In terms of, this band's ability to blow you away. But not only that, here's a secret about this live record. It ain't all that live. I mean, they recorded it in shows in Wildwood, New Jersey, and Cleveland and Detroit, and one other venue that's escaping me. But they recorded 4 shows during the summer of 1975, and they kind of called this album from that's basically the basic tracks. Well, they were not, they were kind of an awkward band in the sense that, sometimes they would play the wrong chord, or sometimes Paul Stanley or Gene Simmons would forget to actually sing into the mic. And sometimes Ace Frehley was off, Ace Frehley and Peter Criss, as Gene Simmons liked to say, were fond of their chemicals and liquids. And so what they did is, with producer Eddie Kramer, who had recorded the shows and engineered the soundboard recordings, they went into the studio and they did considerable overdubbing of the guitars and the vocals in particular. And not only that, but they took the most prominent of their recordings of the audience and the cheering and the audience at their loudest, and they overdubbed and put those in and so the audience tracks you're hearing are not the actual audience tracks. They're the best possible reactions to a Kiss show. A compilation of the best possible reactions, which is why it sounds so exciting and why the energy never dissipates. And those crowd noises are way up in the mix. And so they're playing this in a soup of like the most excitable crowd reactions imaginable. And so the effect of it, and obviously, the overdubs of Ace's guitars and the rhythm guitars and the harmony vocals and all of that, it makes for a really clean, really awesome, really powerful, and it has that bottom that they were missing from the studio records. And so it really becomes a chronicle of the show. Who cares if it was a 1-to-1 recording of the shows or of the songs? It really captured the experience. And so it's a real testament, and it's a real thrill to listen to. And Paul Stanley was just great. He was so cheesy, we love you, and, you wanted the best, you got it. The best band in the world, Kiss, yay! Just really exciting stuff. So I love Alive, and if any album of title ever deserved an exclamation point, it's this one, Alive! Exclamation point. Just awesome.
All right, the next album. Now we're back to the studio. Destroyer from 1976. This is going to be a very controversial opinion, especially among diehard Kiss fans. But starting with this album, I believe the rest of Kiss's 1970s catalog is an uneven up and down affair. At least with Destroyer, they finally got a big league producer in Bob Ezrin, who had previously worked with Alice Cooper and would go on to work with Pink Floyd. I said it was uneven, but by no means does it suck. You still have 2 bona fide all-hail rock and roll arena rock classics with Detroit Rock City and Shout It Out Loud. God of Thunder is a relentlessly heavy piece of brontosaurus rock and could be Gene Simmons' personal theme song, even if it was written by Paul Stanley. And of course, there's the obligatory ballad, this time courtesy of drummer Peter Criss, Beth. A tender song of regret about leaving your loved one behind while you're on the road that reached the top 10 of the Billboard Pop Chart. A good album due to some great individual tracks, but not an all-time classic. Chris?
Yeah, I actually think it's their best record. And
really?
I'm not alone in that. Their best actual studio record. I mean, Alive is their best record overall. but their best
Right.
pure studio record, I think, is this one. I think that Bob Ezrin's effect, basically what he did is Kiss's uh, main attribute is grandiosity. And what he did is he took that grandiosity and made it even like 100 times more grandiose. And so what you get is you get this concept record about basically they're the house band for nihilism. And the cover, which has the four of them leaping from a steaming pile of rubble. They're exploding from the city as it's being destroyed, and so they're the restless youth that's pillaging and stomping their way through it. And so it's much more conceptual. That they don't actually just sing about fucking 16-year-old girls. There's actually more going on in
Yeah.
some of these songs with like Flaming Youth and God of Thunder. There's more mythic content. King of the Nighttime World, which was the first song that they ever did that actually was co-written by outside writers. So there's some proggy elements to it. There's some theatrical elements to it. You get some strings, you get some horns, you get some piano, you get some choral backup singing and choir on there. Like I said, God of Thunder is just this huge, enormous, piece of metal. Like Great Expectations actually apes a classical music piece,
Yeah.
and it just actually outright steals a classical music piece for part of it. And then even Beth is tolerable. I mean, Beth is probably, and I've always back when I was a kid in my 20s, I love the song "Do You Love Me" because it's so cheesy.
Yeah.
You love my 7-inch leather heel, but do you love me? Yeah, so it's basically that it's the sensitive side. It's the real human beings behind the makeup crying
Yeah.
for recognition. And so and Bob Ezrin has an effect on the record in a sense. He has 8 songwriting credits.
Wow.
So he helped co-write 8 of these songs. He basically taught them. He upped their professionalism. He upped their ambition. He got them out of the doldrums. He said, you can't just keep doing the same dopey shit over and over and over again. You got to shake it up, and you have to like reach for the stars. And on
Yeah.
this album, they reached them for sure. Detroit Rock City is honestly, I think that the best Stanley song in the entire Kiss catalog is Detroit Rock City,
Mm.
and the best Simmons song in the entire and actually God of Thunder is not. I think you're right that Stanley wrote that.
Stanley wrote it. Stanley wrote it for
Yeah,
Simmons.
yeah, and so but yeah, Simmons's best song is probably Rock and Roll All Night, which he co-wrote with Stanley.
Yeah.
But it's a quintessential showcase. God of Thunder is its quintessential showcase for Simmons
You're
for
right.
sure. And so you really just this is them at their peak, I think, artistically
You're right.
as a band.
All right, next, also from 1976, Rock and Roll Over. The second Kiss album of this year brought another big name producer, this time Eddie Kramer, known for his sound engineering work with Jimi Hendrix back in the 1960s. Yet another uneven album, it nevertheless produced 2 huge hits that both hit the top 20 of the Billboard pop chart. The Paul Stanley penned, Peter Criss sung sweet acoustic number Hard Luck Woman, which has more than a passing resemblance to the kind of folk rock Rod Stewart was doing earlier in the decade. And the sweaty, sleazy Gene Simmons rocker Calling Dr. Love, which is probably my all-time personal favorite Kiss song. Unfortunately, a few too many childish, dunder-headed tracks like Ladies' Room and Love 'Em and Leave 'Em bring the record down a bit. Chris?
Yeah, this is probably their most juvenile record. I mean, it's just incredible. Like Ladies' Room. I mean, it kind of rocks, but it's funny. It's meet you in the ladies' room for my money. You can't be too soon. Just it's a song literally about getting laid in a ladies' room. And they have other stuff too. The double entendres are crazy. They have another song on there. They actually have a line the line, "I've got a stiff proposition for you." To me, which is dumber? There's Simmons' Ladies' Room, and then there's Paul Stanley has a song called Mr. Speed, I think you can figure out what that one's about. It's so dumb and so juvenile and so crass. But and that's the thing. But here's the thing: "Hard Luck Woman" is actually a pretty good song. Rumor had it that Stanley actually wrote it for Rod Stewart.
Wow.
You don't
Okay.
say.
That's why it sounds like Rod Stewart.
That's why it sounds like Rod Stewart, is because they
Yeah.
were actually apparently were writing it to see if Rod Stewart would actually do it.
Yeah.
And like I said, it does come across as a parody of "Every Picture Tells a Story." And
But it's a good song, though.
yeah, it is a good song. And who knows if Peter Criss actually sang like that, or if that was just a really good impression of Rod Stewart. Either way, it works.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so so good stuff. And then Eddie Kramer, like I said, Eddie Kramer produced Alive, and they brought him back for Rock and Roll
Mm,
Over.
yeah.
It's going to be a dumb sex record. I mean, come on, Rock and Roll Over. That's about as sexist as it gets.
Yeah, I
It's like
know.
that line from Spinal Tap. This is so sexist. Of course it's sexy. No,
No, no, no, no.
sexist.
The line is, what's wrong with being sexy? It's sexist, not sexy, you idiot. One of
Yeah.
the great,
So
great lines from Spinal Tap.
yep. So that's the thing. And then of course, calling Dr. Love, which is so dumb but so fun. I'm not a doctor. Basically, it's calling Dr. Love. I'm not a doctor of love. Calling Dr. Love. I've got the cure you're thinking of. Yeah. So it's their most inspiredly silly, dumb, juvenile fuck rock.
Well,
Is
you know who actually likes this album a little bit more than we do,
who's
and
that?
gave it a B minus. Robert Christgau, the
No
final
shit.
Christgau quote of this episode, quote for Rock and Roll Over. Quote, those who dismiss them as unlistenable are still evading the issue. They write tough, catchy songs, and if they had a sly Mick Jagger style singer, they would be a menace. But they aren't a menace, my wife and my sister assure me. The kids get off on the burlesque. Does this mean that when the cartoon hero in the platform shoes bellows an order to grab the rocket in his pocket, all the 12-year-olds are aware that this is a caricature of sex and macho sex at that? Really, I'd like to know, but I'm not getting down on my knees to find out. End quote.
That's great. Yeah. And he makes a good point, because at this point, they're let's just say that their fan base started to skew really young.
Yeah, kids. Like
By this
12, 14-year-old boys. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
post Alive.
rock and roll comic book. Yay.
Yep, they actually they really did write Rock and Roll Over, and the next couple of records they wrote it with 12-year-old and 13-year-old boys in mind. And so right on, Chris Gow, that he got that right.
Yeah. All right. The next album, also from 1977, Love Gun.
Yep.
This one is a little better than Rock and Roll Over, but still not quite mustering the heights of their earlier records. One of Ace Frehley's best songs, Shock Me,
Oh yeah.
is a riff-rocking, wonderful ode to sadomasochistic bondage sex. The title track is classic arena-swaying, head-banging piss in all its glory. And of course, leave it to Gene Simmons to provide the sleaziest tracks on the album. Christine 16, yes, you can guess what that song's about, and Plaster Caster, about the Los Angeles sisters known for making plaster casts out of famous
cocks.
rock stars' penises.
Yeah.
Like the previous two, up and down, but the ups are worth it. Chris?
Yeah, the ups are very worth it, and they get back a little bit. It's probably closer in character to Rock and Roll Over, but they do get back to some of the theatricality of Destroyer with Love Gun, and actually Shock Me is, like you said, is one of Ace Frehley's best songs, and it's the first song he actually sang. He had stage fright. He had a fear of singing. He was too self-conscious about his voice. So Gene Simmons would sing his stuff. So this is his he probably should have kept Simmons to singing, because his voice kind of sucks. But it's still a fun song. You basically just the metaphor of lightning. That girl is like lightning, And yeah,
Yeah.
in an S&M context, boy, that is some
Right.
grease. That is greased lightning for sure. And so, and the interesting thing about Love Gun too, we have to talk about this a little bit. They end the album with a cover of an old song by a Phil Spector girl group named the Crystals.
Uh-huh.
Their version was called "Then He Kissed Me."
Right.
Kiss covers it as "Then She Kissed Me,"
Right.
and it proves one of the things about Kiss is people have to understand is musically they weren't trying to reinvent anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were doing their take on glam metal. They were taking their take on pop, their take on soul, their take on all the stuff that came in, basically post Dylan rock and roll, basically American and British rock and roll between 65 and 71. And
Yeah.
it's their take on it. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody that they do a really orthodox cover, right down to the drumming patterns, the
Right.
kind of those kind of clapping patterns that Phil Spector
Right.
used to do, those bloom,
Yeah.
and doing that. So a very orthodox cover of a Phil Spector song ends this, and that really kind of signals the direction that they were going to go in over the next several years. That a kitschier, poppier direction.
Right.
And
Right.
so ending this record on that is like kind of a perfect prelude to where they went for the 5 years that followed.
Right. Right. But not before they would put out another live album. Next, Alive 2 from 1977. One thing that has never let Kiss down is their live performance. And with their studio albums getting increasingly mediocre, they went back to that formula for one of their biggest selling albums ever.
Yep.
Well, at least, 3/4 of this double album is live. The last 1/4 was recorded live on stage at the Passaic Theater in New Jersey without an audience and then overdubbed and mixed in the studio. Nevertheless, the very best tracks from their recent albums, the post Dress to Kill albums, are all represented here in their very best form. Is it their second best overall album after Alive? I would say so. Chris?
Yeah, it probably is. I mean, because again, it's the best of those three records done with the same treatment of
Right.
heavy overdubs and the piped in crowd noise, and it has the feel. By then, the shows were bigger and they were more rollicking, and so obviously the songs and the crowd noise are bigger and more rollicking on this record, and so it was really
Yeah.
a perfect distillation. 77 was the peak for Kiss. That was the peak of the
Yes.
Kiss Army. That's when, like when they released Love Gun, they actually had a merchandise catalog in the sleeve.
Yeah.
And this is where, the kids coming with the face paint and folks, becoming the event of the year, going to the Kiss show. They were the most
Right.
popular band in America at that point.
Right.
And so this is a reflection of that phenomenon. The five songs that make up side four are all crappy. I mean, it's basically a throwaway thing. Ace Frehley has the best of the five tracks. With not a surprise, Rocket Ride. He's pretty inspired.
I wonder
There.
what that song's about.
Yeah, gee, I have no idea. And there's also a cover of Dave Clark's "Any Way You Want It," which is pretty cheesy.
Yeah.
And not that great. So basically, it's like a throwaway side. It was just an excuse to release a few new songs and just
Yeah.
more of a marketing gimmick than it was
Yeah.
anything else. And
Right.
it's like they wanted the 15 songs. I'm assuming that it was probably a shorter set than a live one, and so
Yeah.
they were looking for filler, and that was the
Yeah.
filler, and
Yep.
not so great.
Right.
Not so great.
And now we get to the final Kiss album of the 1970s, Dynasty from 1979. Even the gods of rock that were Kiss had to bow down to the gods of disco in the late 1970s.
Yeah, no shit.
And that's exactly what the band did on their last album of the decade, most explicitly so on the massive hit single, Paul Stanley's I Was Made for Lovin' You, which hit number 11 in the Billboard chart and either number 1 or number 2 in 11 countries around the world. Even the crustiest fan of hard rock has to admit that this is a pretty impeccable pop song. Otherwise, The album is kind of a stinker. Drummer Peter Criss had a car accident the year before that damaged his hands, impairing his drumming ability and led to his further descent into drug and alcohol addiction. He only contributed to and played on one track on the album, Dirty Livin', a song as bad in its attempt at phony disco as I Was Made for Lovin' You was seamlessly perfect in its attempt at glorious disco rock. Shitty attempts at pop rock and new wave abound, with neither of the other members in their best songwriting form, made abundantly clear by the head-scratching inclusion of a horrendous cover of the Rolling Stones' 2000 Man.
Oh, like that.
However, Chris, I was about to say, I have a feeling you like this album a little more than I do.
I don't like the album. I like the cover of 2000 Man. Here's the thing. By this point in 1979, the only member of the band who still wanted to be in the iteration that everybody knew of Kiss was Ace Frehley.
Right.
That obviously Simmons and Stanley were feeling a little confined and were looking for something different, or were trying to figure out the next chapter, which is why they probably seized onto disco. I Was Made for Lovin' You was co-written by a guy named Desmond Child, who became a song doctor extraordinaire to the Stars. He co-wrote hits for Bon Jovi and Aerosmith, and was all over the place in the 80s. Basically under the radar, but he was a song doctor, and so he co-wrote "I Was Made for Loving You" with Stanley. But Frehley was the only one that actually acted like he wanted to still be in this band. Peter Criss only plays on one song. A guy named Anton Fig did the drums, and this was Peter Criss's last album with Kiss. He would be fired the next year. And Frehley does two other songs on this record, Hard Times and Save Your Love, both of which sound like Kiss songs. And Stanley and Simmons don't even play on those songs. Frehley does all the guitars and all the bass on those songs. So Frehley's working on his own, and he's starting to have, some friction with the band too. And meanwhile, Simmons and Stanley are trying to be disco dance boy, kind of like Mick Jagger. So they're going for that, and they're only succeeding once. When they try to do it on their own and with their new producer, whose name is escaping me, but it wasn't Eddie Kramer. They just failed miserably. And
Chris, in between Alive 2 and Dynasty,
they did solo records.
They did 4 solo records, and they all sucked.
Yeah, Frehley's is okay. Frehley's is at least mildly enjoyable. That was their other thing. In addition to the live record, each member made a solo record without any contribution from any of the other three, like true solo records, and they were all released with similar hand-drawn covers of each member. They were all released on the same day. Yeah, and they all flopped. They didn't sell. And I think Frehley's did the best of the 4 of them, and it was actually which is okay, but so they were trying to be something else. I mean, they were obviously Simmons and Stanley were trying to figure out what the next chapter of Kiss was. Here's the memo: it wasn't disco. I Was Made for Loving You is a great fucking song. My classic rock station in Houston plays it all the time. 2000 Man, love it. I think it's a really energetic cover. And then who knows? Maybe it doesn't have the psychedelic sheen of the original, which is from Her Satanic Majesty. What's it called? Her Satanic Majesty's Request.
It's called Their Satanic Majesty's Request. We covered that album several years ago.
Yes, we did. Their Majesty's.
Their Satanic Majesty's Request.
Yes. Okay, I always get that wrong. Thank you for setting me right. It's not quite as artistic as that, but it rocks. And it's a dumb cover, but it's a good dumb cover. The rest of the album is a flaming turd.
On this episode, we dived deeply into the music of Kiss in the 1970s. For the next episode, we're going to explore a musical phenomenon that eventually became an out-of-control pop cultural phenomenon that dominated the musical landscape from the middle up to the very end of the 1970s. disco. From its underground origins in Manhattan loft parties that catered to ethnic minorities in the gay community, this liberating, free-flowing, decadent style of dance music soon became big in gay nightclubs throughout the country and eventually the world, crossing over to the mainstream and the zeitgeist of popular culture in such a short time and an accelerated way that it seemed to overwhelm everything in its wake, influencing not just all genres of music, but fashion, art, and cinema as well. The eventual backlash of the early 1980s sent disco back underground to mutate into another form of dance music. But this episode is going to focus on that period of time when disco was inescapable. Its origins, its historical progression, its infiltration, and its domination of the musical landscape will be discussed in loving detail, as both curmudgeons truly believe this was some of the greatest, most sophisticated pop music of the entire 20th century. Yes, seriously. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you a history of disco. So we're reaching the end of our episode here, immortalizing Kiss in the 1970s. But we got to talk a little bit about what happened to Kiss after the 1970s, from the 1980s onward. And don't worry, folks, we're not going to go into detail into those terrible records, but we do have to talk about it a bit, and basically to put a nice ribbon and bow at the end of this package. Chris?
Yeah, so Kiss's story from 1979 on is one of the more fascinating in rock, if you think about it, in terms of the descent and then the reascent and then the reascent, ascent.
Yeah.
And it becoming this big corporate, never-ending touring show,
Right.
and this nostalgia act. And one of the great nostalgia acts of all time is where they eventually ended up. So what happens is, like I said when we were covering Dynasty, clearly Simmons and Stanley were feeling the weight of being this large, hugely popular mainstream band, and were thinking of the next chapter. They clearly were restless. They clearly weren't like feeling what they had been doing. And part of that is because they were starting to look out at their shows, and what they were seeing was not teenagers and was not young adults. Now they're starting to see 9-year-olds and their parents.
Yeah.
And, wearing the face makeup. And so now they're playing for little kids. Yeah. And so between that, and so they're running out of inspiration as far as that. They want to be something different. They tried Dynasty. That was I believe their first record to not go gold. Well, that's not true. I think that Unmasked, I think, was where it really dropped off. But they had the big hit single, but it quickly dropped off the charts and obviously got panned by critics. And during that time, like I said, Peter Criss, because of his car accident, because of chemical dependencies, fell off and was fired in 1980. They did a follow-up album in 1980 called Unmasked, which is a really terrible wannabe new wave record. And that bombed. That was their first album to be commercially unsuccessful in a long, long time. And it turned out to be kind of the beginning of the end, because from there, they talked about wanting to get back to making an album that rock. Instead, they got together again with Bob Ezrin, who was coming off the success of The Wall and who was clearly becoming kind of the theatrical rock producer du jour, and was really in demand. And so they decided to get more in tune with their artistic side, and they came out with an album called Music from the Elder in 1981, which is actually, I think, kind of underrated. It was bombed at the time. It didn't sell. They were desperate for hits, and so it was supposed to be a concept record, but the label took it out of sequence to highlight the potential hits. And so you had a sci-fi fantasy concept record that made little sense to begin with. And now you take it out of order and it makes zero sense. But they got a modest hit in there called A World Without Heroes, which is a modest hit in Europe. It kind of bombed here, and it was covered by Cher eventually, who Simmons dated for a few years.
Yeah.
But anyway, Frehley was so turned off by the experience of making that record and that they were getting away from being a real rock band that he essentially phoned it in. Like he literally recorded all his parts from his home studio and wouldn't even travel to Toronto where the album was made.
Wow.
And so he was so disgusted with where they were. Plus, he was also in the midst of a deep addiction to painkillers. And so by 1982, he's effectively done with the band. He didn't play on any album subsequent to Music from the Elder, although he still made the promotional photos for the next album or two. So what happened? So they had one last vestige of greatness while they were still in the makeup, and that's 1982 single "I Love It Loud" from the album Creatures of the Night. That's a song co-written by Gene Simmons and Vinnie Vincent. Vinnie Vincent was actually a really talented guitar player and songwriter who was in the band for 2 years. He wasn't an official member of the band in Creatures of the Night, but he plays on it. I Love It Loud. Look it up. An awesome 3.5 minute pop song. And just pop rock and just really kind of sweaty and dirty and nasty and kind of a throwback to what Kiss had been doing in the early 70s. And so that was like their last hurrah in that phase. But again, commercial failure, critical failure. And so they're at a crossroads. MTV is now on the air. And in 81, 82, Quiet Riot had broken out. So too had Motley Crue had broken out. And Ozzy Osbourne as a solo act with Randy Rhoads had all broken out. So LA metal, the hairspray metal had started in earnest at that point in the early 80s.
It's ironic because Kiss was like a fundamental keystone influence on all that hair metal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really, it was Kiss who kickstarted that whole thing.
Yeah. Motley Crue is a combination of like Roxy Music and Kiss.
Much more Kiss than Roxy Music.
Yeah, much more Kiss.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're just they were a huge influence on that whole scene. And so they decided to go all in. MTV is doing these sort of pop pretty boy bands. And so they're going to drop the cartoon act, which, basically they had become subject of ridicule. There had been a huge backlash starting in the late 70s that people got tired of Kiss everywhere and the Kiss Army and all the cheesy demon stuff. And so they decided that we're going to be a couple of ugly Jewish boys from the outer boroughs of New York. And they took the makeup off and they wore spandex and tight shirts and earrings, and they really glammed it up. And out came the album in 1983, Lick It Up. Lick it up. Great single.
I wonder what that song's about.
Yeah, I have no idea. Yeah, they were one of the least ambiguous bands of all time when it came to the content of their songs. Incredibly unambiguous. But Lick It Up comes out. It goes into heavy rotation in MTV. They get back to selling platinum records with this record, and then they had a streak in the 80s. The next year, 84, they came out with the album Animalize, which has the song Heaven's on Fire. Vinnie Vincent had left the band at this point, that they didn't really get along. Vincent, he had drug issues too, and he had personality conflicts with Simmons and Stanley. And so out he goes. In comes a guy named Mark St. John. He plays on Animalize. The song Heaven's on Fire becomes a big hit and is in heavy rotation on MTV. Another co-write by Desmond Child, by the way. And then they do a couple of other records the next year. So Mark St. John's only on the record. In comes Bruce Kulick, who ended up in the band for 12 more years before they went back to the classic lineup to do the nostalgia tours. And so Bruce Kulick's a really great guitar player. And so they have a few other hits in the 80s. They have Crazy Crazy Nights, which is one of their cheesier songs. And basically all it is Paul Stanley said, "I want to hear you sing it. Come on." Doing Paul Stanley's thing. There's that. There's the bonus track from their greatest hits album that they came out with in 1988 called Let's Put the X in Sex. Yeah, one of the all-time great
Song titles.
song titles. That's a co-write by Paul Stanley and Desmond Child, and that becomes a modest hit. And then they revisited the top 10 the next year with the song Forever, co-written by Michael Bolton.
Wow.
Yes, that Michael Bolton. Yeah, the guy with the mullet and the big cornflake voice. Yeah, so Forever reaches number 8 on the Hot 100 for Billboard in 1989. So that's Kiss in the 80s. In the 90s, they got a little bit more harder edged. They kind of went with they got a little grungier, they got a little punkier, they got a little nastier, and they made a couple of decent records. Bob Ezrin came back and helped them make a couple of albums. But then in 1995, they start to there starts to be a real nostalgia for their shows and for the 70s. All things 70s are back and cool again by the mid 90s, and they get the itch and they do an unplugged MTV Unplugged taping in the summer of 1995, and they invited Ace Frehley and Peter Criss to sit in for a 4 or 5 song set. That was recorded as part of that, and it obviously was a huge response. Audience went nuts, and was the MTV audience was hugely receptive to that. And so what happens is in the summer of '96, Frehley and Criss are once again part of the band, and they go on a worldwide stadium tour. And they opened in Tiger Stadium, of all places, is where they opened up the first reunion tour, and that's basically what they've been doing ever since. Is recreating their '70s glory, and just bigger and badder and fierier and bloodier and more histrionic, and just going as over the top as they can in the Kiss Army and in the original face paint, and to the point where Frehley and Criss were back out by 2001. Although Criss came back briefly in I think '03 and '04, but they were replaced by a guy named Tommy Thayer, who had played in a Kiss cover band in L.A. In the '80s, and Eric Singer, the drummer, who had been the drummer prior to Peter Criss coming back. He comes back in, and so the band's lineup for 20 something years was Stanley, Simmons, Thayer, and Singer. And it takes them to what was a 4-year long farewell tour,
which they're ending this year, I think.
They ended it in December of 23. They finally ended that tour, the never-ending tour at Madison Square Garden, where it all began in New York City.
Right.
And that supposedly is their final show, because according to Wikipedia and other sources that I consulted with, Gene Simmons' big obsession now is the development of digital avatars for the band. And so what'll happen is, starting in 2027, the avatars will go on tour.
Right.
And so you'll have what amounts to a digital hologram concert.
Of Kiss.
Of Kiss. And so that's what they're staking their future on. So not just Kiss coffins and not just Kiss cruises. They would play Kiss cruises, and they did it. And that was the other thing too, is that the reunion tour gave Simmons, who had always been a master brander and marketer and merchandiser, it gave him like extra. So they were coming up with Kiss coffins and Kiss coolers and Kiss refrigerators, and they had Kiss theme restaurants, and just they actually owned for 2 years they owned an Arena Football League team called the Los Angeles Kiss. Not kidding. There was actually a reality show that chronicled their ownership of the LA Kiss. So that they had themselves a run where they went in the pits, and they had to take the makeup off just for their survival. Then with MTV, they got a fortuitous bounce, and then they became irrelevant again. And then they went the nostalgia route and became very relevant, and became one of the biggest touring acts in the world, and remained so for almost 30 years. Pretty impressive story. Wouldn't you say, Arturo?
Yeah, it is. In the end, though, like their legacy, it all comes for me, in my opinion. Yes, of course, the pyrotechnics and the makeup and the explosions and the fire and the blood and all that stuff. And so it's their stage show, it's their merchandising. Okay. You
Yep.
cannot understate the merchandising.
Yeah, the
I mean,
action figures, T-shirts,
they
logos,
took it.
stickers, lunchboxes.
Like I said in the parameter setter of this episode earlier on, George Lucas must have been watching.
Yeah, hell yeah.
You know, because like what he did with his Star Wars empire is what Kiss was doing in the mid
Yeah.
70s. So like Kiss's legacy comes down to three things: their stage show, making rock and roll a spectacle, the merchandising, and musically how they were the touchstone core influence on 1980s glam metal and hair metal.
And also 1990s grunge, because Mike McCready and Kim Thale are both on record as saying Ace Frehley was their hero.
Yeah, Kim Thayil. Yeah, I mean, Kim Thayil said it, and the Pearl Jam guitarists have always said that they loved Kiss growing up. So yeah, I can see that, because early Kiss did have a bit of a grungy sound to them.
Yep.
The earlier records, but
Frehley was a hell of a player too.
He was a great guitar player, but yeah, that to me, if that's Kiss's legacy is three-pronged, it's those three things I just mentioned.
Yep, you know? and to build on that, the ultimate portrayal of their legacy is I am the proud owner of a replica Kiss lunchbox.
Really? Nice.
Yeah, I bought this at Midtown Comics in 1999. Midtown Comics is the greatest comic book store ever.
I remember. I remember when you bought that. Yeah,
located in Times Square. I bought the replica for Love Gun. It's the album cover to Love Gun on a lunchbox. Yeah. And so, I've shed most of the stupid shit that I bought when I was in my late teens and early 20s. But that's one of the few things I still have in my possession, and it is displayed proudly in the office of our house, my wife and I's house. So so I have my replica Love Gun lunchbox, and that's all you need to know about their influence. Without Kiss, rock stars would never have sold lunchboxes.
No shit.
No shit at all. No shit at all.
Right. And so we've reached the end, ladies and gentlemen, of our Kiss retrospective. We hope you enjoyed it. I for one enjoyed doing a bit of my research for this, and Chris, you're a bit of a bigger Kiss fan than I am, so this episode was for you, my friend.
Oh shucks, yeah, no, I immensely enjoyed diving back into their catalog. There's a lot of cheesy stuff, a lot of great over the top rock songs, a lot of great riffs, a lot of great theatrical kind of shit. Kiss is one of the great dumb bands in the history of rock. That they might be the greatest dumb band in rock history.
Maybe, yeah.
They're one of them. They're not stupid, but they are dumb. And as a dumb rock and roll band, they are almost unparalleled. And with that, folks, as we always do at the end of these episodes, we encourage you to join our Facebook Curmudgeonly community. And the Facebook community is indeed on Facebook. You can find us at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. We've been posting a lot of Kiss in the last week, and we'll be posting a lot of disco in the coming weeks. So please join us up there for merriment and mirth. It's an invite-only community, but chances are we'll let you in. Also, if you have any thoughts about Kiss, or if you agree with us, or if you're a member of the Kiss Army, or if you hate Kiss with as much as you hate life itself, definitely reach out to us at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. We always like fan mail. And then also, please check out our special Spotify playlist that we're making in Kiss's honor. You'll be able to find the link to that playlist in our episode description, wherever you're accessing this podcast, whether it's Apple or Stitcher or Amazon or any other platform. Look in the episode description, and there will be the link to our Spotify playlist. We definitely know that you want to rock and roll all night and party every day, and we're making it possible.